What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another Joey-Pegasus Format video. After a brief detour into Android format with my last video, we are now diving straight into this new format, and I think it's a lot of fun. I haven't had much time to really test out this deck. I really wanted to sort of get a sort of good stuff BS mirror for this video, but I did get a game of this deck that does show how well it can perform against decks that are not quite at the meta level. Before we dive into the games though, let's do a card by card breakdown of what this deck actually is. So this is basically the Beast Spellcaster deck for Joey-Pegasus, which is just the good stuff pile basically. So we're playing pretty much all the good monsters, all the good spells and traps, etc. So I do think that this deck is probably the best deck in the format just because it's a collection of the best cards in the format. But there will be more decks to explore after I cover this one. And I do think that this version of the deck may not be the most optimized version of it. Testing against other decks that are sort of at this level will determine whether that's the case or not. But let's dive into the card by card. So we've got the Triangle of Beaters that's present in Android format, Bazoo the Soul Eater, Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer, and Gemini Elf. And as a note, just like in Android format, Kaiku and Bazoo can both banish any cards from the graveyard instead of just monster cards. We've also got 3 Mystic Tomato to fetch out our copies of Witch of the Black Forest and Sangan, which are the recruiters that can pretty much get any card we want to from our deck to our hand, so it's very nice in that regard. We've also got a Cannon Soldier which is being searched off of the Tomato as a bit of last damage at the end of the game if you drop your opponent down beneath a certain threshold. We're also playing Scapegoat to pair with the Cannon Soldier, which can be very nice. You sort of just do a Scapegoat in your opponent's end phase, summon out Cannon Soldier, and tribute the entire board for 2,500. Of course, that is somewhat disruptible, but, you know, if you're able to pull it off, it's an insanely strong combo to end out the game. We've also got a Cyberjar here, which is great removal. It can clear Jinzo as well as any other offensive threats that your opponent might have. It's not perfect, but it is generally pretty good. We're playing a Jinzo because it's just insane, shuts down all your opponent's traps, and enables you to go for some major aggressive pushes. We're playing 2 Magician of the Faith to get back our powerful spells, of which we are playing a lot, so I do think that 2 is pretty good. You could probably up this up to 3. I do think, honestly, that given Magician of Faith's power in this format, Nobleman of Crossout could be a reasonable card to consider in the main deck. This deck is not playing it, but I do think that it could be an option for the future. We're also playing a Sinister Serpent, which is a great monster that just comes back to your hand from the graveyard every turn. It's a free resource to pitch off something like Graceful Charity. It can also be used with something like Tribute to the Doomed or Magic Jammer if you want to play those. And lastly, for the monsters, we've got 3 Thunder Dragon. These are our main pitch off of Charity. You know, we draw Thunder Dragon, we discard to the graveyard, get 2 more to hand, deck then a bit, then pitch for Charity, and basically get free value off of that. It's not exactly free value. It does, you know, require you to go through some hoops, and the Thunder Dragons can brick, which is always unfortunate. But, you know, it's not a terrible card to have in hand, and also it does have other synergies with things like Change of Heart or Snatch Deal. You can take control of your opponent's monster, then tribute it over for a Thunder Dragon. Obviously not the best, but it is something that you can do with this card. I also think maybe in the future, this is maybe a card to cut, as you might just want to sort of include more high value cards than Thunder Dragon. But I don't think it's a bad card, and I do think that it's something that a lot of people will be experimenting with, including myself. For these spells, we've got just insane cards all the way through. We've got Change of Heart, Confiscation, Darkhold, Delinquent Duo, 2 Graceful Charity, a Monster Reborn, a Painful Choice, a Pot of Greed, a Raigeki, a Snatch Deal, and a Forceful Sentry. I feel like all those cards don't really need much explanation. They're all just insanely strong and completely broken. For the spell and trap removal, we're playing 1 Harpy's Feather Duster and 3 Mystical Space Typhoon. This is basically the same ratio that we had in Android format for this deck. We just replaced the Heavy Storm with a Harpy's Feather Duster because Harpy's Feather Duster is strictly better for our purposes. The Mystical Space Typhoons here are very nice at dealing with threats reactively, things like Imperial Order. It's great to have the Mystical Space Typhoons on hand to deal with that. Snatch Deal and Call of the Haunted as well. It's good to have those Mystical Space Typhoons on hand for. And the last spell that we have in here that's not like a generic power staple is the Scapegoat that we mentioned earlier with the Cannon Soldier. I do think it's good to have this as a defensive option if your opponent does go for Jinzo. This is one of the only ways to stop a big aggressive push that turn. Lastly, we're playing very little traps. We've only got a Call of the Haunted, Imperial Order, and a Mirror Force. All of these are insanely strong, though, so they're very good. You could potentially play more traps like Torrential Tribute or Jar of Greed, or even something like Ceasefire, maybe. And we do have these in the side to experiment with, but I do just think these 3 traps are the core traps that should be in pretty much every deck, as they're insanely powerful. The side deck is geared for some, specific matchups. For instance, Penguin Knights here for Empty Jar, Exchanges here for Exodia, Heavy Storms here in case we need more back row removal for something like Burn, or a deck that requires heavy back row support. We've also got 2 Noblemen of Crossout and a Ceasefire in case our opponent's on a more flip-heavy strategy, another Scapegoat in case our opponent's on a more aggressive strategy. But the last 6 cards in the side deck, honestly, are just here for me to test with. So I've got 3 Jars of Greed and 3 Torrential Tributes. The reason why I have the Jars of Greed in here is I'm actually kind of curious if we can just play 3 Jars of Greed instead of 3 Thunder Dragons. This makes for a better Painful Choice selection off of that, because if you send 3 Jars of Greed and your opponent gives you the Jar of Greed, it actually can get you some more value as opposed to Thunder Dragons, which don't get you any value. But at the same time, it's a lot worse to discard a Jar of Greed off of a Graceful than a Thunder Dragon. But also, they both deck thin. The Jar of Greed can potentially equate to stronger cards later on. And even if you don't have necessarily the ideal pitches to pitch off of a Graceful Charity activation, it can still be good to see more of your deck and get the options that you do want to see. So I am kind of considering just cutting the Thunder Dragons for the Jar of Greed, and that's why they're in the side here to experiment with. The Torrential Tributes are also here for experimentation in case we find that this deck has an issue sort of mounting a defensive pressure, or our opponent's just able to set up a board and we're not able to out it. Torrential Tribute could be a good option to include, maybe over something like Scapegoat. But, that's why I have these cards here in the side to, sort of play around with and just see how it feels. The Fusion deck here really doesn't matter. We're never going to summon any of these. They're just here to sort of mask what we're playing. And that's going to do it for the deck breakdown. Now, as I said, I really would have liked to have had this against a sort of another Good Stuff deck as a mirror, but unfortunately, I didn't have time to get that match. I will be planning on recording that match in the future, so look forward to that. But for now, let's dive into a game with this and see how it plays. Okay, we've got a game against History of YGO1, a frequent guest on the channel, and we are playing the Good Stuff deck. They're not playing the Good Stuff deck. I found this out in the match. You'll see what they're playing pretty soon. But it's not even something that I'd necessarily call tier 2 or maybe even rogue. It might even be a trash level deck, but I mean, I still think it's good to show off these sorts of things, both to show how viable the other deck is and also to show how viable our deck is and how much of an uphill battle it can be to deal with this sort of meta threat. Our opponent's going to start off with a Graceful Charity, which is very nice. Always good to open that. We're really hoping that they don't open a hand rip to deplete our hand, because our hand is looking pretty good. They're going to send a Fire Princess and a Harpy's Feather Duster, and that Fire Princess reveals what they're on. They're on Princess Burn. Princess Burn's a deck that I featured in Android format. Didn't think it was very good. I still have that opinion here. But it did receive some improvements with the Graceful Charities, enabling it to do a sort of different strategy. So people have been testing that out a little bit. We draw a Scapegoat, which is not bad, but against this deck, it's actually pretty bad. Thunder Dragon, though, is very nice. We can add to hand to deck then. Also have the Graceful set up for later. We can also do Change of Heart into a Thunder Dragon, which is very nice, so we might want to do that later. For now, though, we're just going to go for the Gemini Elf, attack into their set, and it is a Witch of the Black Forest, and this is why we did this in this order, so that way now in main phase 2, we can go for the Forceful Sentry here and see what they've got. They're going to fire Imperial Order now, which is kind of interesting. I would have figured that they saved that for the pot, but, it won't really matter here either way because we do have the Mystical Space Typhoon to get rid of that. So we will be able to see their hand here, and that is a pretty good one. Reborn and Raigeki are both kind of annoying. We could shuffle back the Reborn because, that they don't really have a way to search that out. And if we shuffle back like the Sangan or the Fire Princess, they can just Reborn out the Witch and then get them back that way. But honestly, I kind of want them to do that. I feel like that's a activation of Reborn that is not very good. So I feel like I actually want to send back the Reborn, and I feel like we can play around Raigeki a bit. Raigeki would be another pick here. But against a deck like Princess Burn, which probably is playing a fair amount of Floodgates, I do just want to sort of get aggressive really quickly. And I don't want them to be able to wall up with more monsters with Reborn and Sangan. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to take the Sangan, send that back to deck, and just try and bait them into using the Reborn next turn. We're going to set a Scapegoat and a Call of the Haunted here, pass back to them. We know that they've used up the Harpy's Feather Dusters, they sent that to grave, and they likely aren't playing Heavy Storm. They're going to go for a Reborn here and target the Witch. That's fine by us. And they're going to get that back. But again, you know, this is kind of what we wanted to happen. I feel like that's not the most optimal use of a Reborn. So, you know, we'll take that. We draw a Bazoo, and we, you know, are debating whether to play into the Raigeki, and I think I just will. I want to force out that Raigeki as soon as possible. We do have follow-up plays to remove their monsters later with Change of Heart and Thunder Dragon. So I just want to get as aggressive as possible and force them to use up that Raigeki. They had Cyberchar to hand, which, you know, won't actually matter based on our hand here. You can always just Change of Heart it into a Thunder Dragon. They do fire the Raigeki here. They're going to summon out that Fire Princess, which is very interesting. And they're going to attack in for 1300. We're going to think about this, and we are just going to Call of the Haunted, the elf here. We could have activated the Scapegoat instead, but I like the Call of the Haunted play better because this just gets us aggressive pressure on board. They've already used up Raigeki, so they likely don't really have any other removal for the elf. And this is probably the best value target we can get off this. We could get back Bazoo, which might be more damage in the long run, but it plays a bit more poorly into Gravity Bind, and we've only got 5 monsters in graveyard, or not 5 monsters, 5 cards in graveyard, so it wouldn't necessarily be the best. Magician of Faith is an incredible draw here. We can use that to get back Mystical Space Typhoon in case they have a Floodgate, and they indeed do. So we'll just set that Magician of Faith. They're going to flip up Solemn Wishes in the end phase, and they're going to start burning. So they gain 500 off that, and we lose 500 due to the Fire Princess's effect. They're going to set another, switch the Fire Princess's defense, pass back to us. But honestly, I feel pretty fine about this. We're just going to Magician of Faith, and we could potentially get back like Pot of Greed or something, but we might as well just go for a Mystical Space Typhoon, try and hit that Gravity Bind and get in for some damage here. They've got Magic Jammer, unfortunately, so, you know, we won't really be able to do anything about that. They do discard the Cyberjar, though, which is very nice. So now we can feel comfortable using the Change of Heart to get rid of the Fire Princess here instead. Instead of going for the Thunder Dragon play like I was talking about before, I figure it's probably better just to go for the Cannon Soldier play here. That way the Thunder Dragons are still in hand in case we draw Graceful Charity, and we can also tribute off this Magician of Faith as well. Although, actually, I do misplay this. I should have just attacked in with the Magician of Faith to get 300 extra damage, and then tributed it off for Cannon Soldier. So I misplayed that very slightly. Probably won't matter in the end. Like, as you'll see, this deck can handle this sort of deck very, very handily. So, you know, I don't really think it's that big of a deal, but every little bit can help, so I should have done that just in case. We're going to go for a Graceful Charity here, which is perfect. We can pitch these Thunder Dragons here, and we draw into another Graceful Charity, which is honestly pretty great. We're going to go for that other Graceful Charity, draw 3 more. We're going to discard the Confiscation since there are very low cards in hand, and, you know, in these sorts of situations, Confiscation is a bit less good. We're also going to discard this Elf since we already have an Elf on field. Then we're just going to set this Magician of Faith, pass back to them, try and get back that Mystical Space Typhoon next turn, and go for another hit on the Gravity Bind. So I feel pretty good about that. You know, they're going to gain 1,000, so we do lose 1,000 off the Fire Princess, which is unfortunate. They're going to set another pass back to us. We draw Reborn, which is pretty nice, though. We are going to think about this because, you know, we might want to wait to get back the Mystical Space Typhoon in case their other set is something good. But I think we just got to go for it. You know, they've used up IO already. Magic Jammer can't be used in case they've got no cards in hand, which they have no cards in hand. And if it's Solemn Judgment or something, that does drop them down a fair bit of damage. And we can potentially go for a Cannon Soldier plus Scapegoat play a bit later to finish them off. So I feel perfectly fine about just going for the Mystical Space Typhoon here. And that is indeed what I think we're going to do. Yep, we grab that back. We are going to fire the Mystical Space Typhoon on that Gravity Bind, and then we're just going to attack in. We could have tributed off the Magician of Faith beforehand with the Cannon Soldier, just to get that guaranteed bit of 500 damage in case they've got like a Mirror Force set. But I figure it's not that big of a deal, and they unfortunately do have the Mirror Force set, so we will lose our Magician of Faith as well. So we kind of lost out on 500 damage there, but I'm feeling pretty fine about that. We've got a Reborn, we've got a Sangan. We're doing perfectly good. They're going to gain 1,000 off the Solemn, switch the Fire Princess to defense, and that's fine by us because we can just get over it here. And Imperial Order is a great draw. That'll shut off any of their spells that can be used to come back here. Now, we've got a bit of a debate here. They think we're stalling because we're kind of stymied, but we're not really stymied. The play is definitely to summon out the Kaiku, attack over the Fire Princess, attack him with Sangan. The question is whether we also want to use Monster Reborn to really put the screws on them and get the aggressive pressure really going. Because they're just going to gain back the 1,000 that we deal to them off of Sangan this turn anyways. So it might be worth just going for the Reborn here. Looks like we're not going to do that, though, and I think that this is the smart play ultimately, because we want to potentially save the Reborn for a big play with the Cannon Soldier and Scapegoat at the end. So I feel like we can just do this way, and I think that this probably is smart. They're going to go for Messenger of Peace here, and that's fine by us. We draw Sinister Serpent, which is great, and I think we actually do win the game here, potentially. We're going to Reborn back this Cannon Soldier, summon out this Sinister Serpent, Imperial Order their Messenger of Peace here. This will be 2,400, 4,200, 4,500, so it won't quite be lethal, but, I mean, we're in a very, very good position here. We can also banish 2 of their monsters from grave with the Kaiku, cutting off some of their access to Fire Princess for later. And if you lose the Fire Princess on this deck, the deck's main condition just becomes deck out, which is not the best. So they're going to drop down to 3,600. We are going to Cannon Soldier away that Sinister Serpent, deal 500, and then pass back to them. We could have also Cannon Soldiered away the Sangan here, get a search off that, but I think we're in a very good position for next turn. And it looks like they will just admit defeat here. Yeah, they just drew a Dark Lord Marie and a Tribute to the Doomed, which will not help. Dark Lord Marie is the sort of new sort of strategy that this deck can do in Joey-Pegasus. If you've got the Graceful Charities, you can draw into Dark Lord Maries, discard them to the graveyard. They gain you additional life points during your standby phase, which can buff up the damage that Fire Princess is doing to quite a fair bit. However, you know, I do think that this game does show that this deck has a lot of inevitability. And in a much slower burn deck, like Princess Burn, that has very fragile board states, sometimes it just can't compete. So we're going to go into game 2, and I don't think we really side much in. I think we bring in a Heavy Storm, maybe side out the Scapegoat, although I can't quite remember. I mean, like, we don't have too many cards on the side to deal with, like, a heavy back row deck. Maybe we could add some more Dust Tornadoes after we're done testing. But I feel like this is perfectly fine. We draw Thunder Dragon, which is pretty great here. We're going to start with a Painful Choice, just see if it gets met with Imperial Order. That's why we do this instead of the Graceful Charity Thunder Dragon play first. Also, you know, this does deck thin a little bit. However, you know, as I said, with, you know, not having the Jars of Greed in deck, there's a lot worse Painful Choice options to send here. However, you know, there's still great options in the form of the Hand Rips. So we are going to be able to send Sinister Serpent plus 3 Hand Rips, and also able to send a Tomato as well. They're probably going to give us the Sinister Serpent, but, you know, the Tomato is going to be a lot less valuable here, given that they're not really attacking over it in battle. So we are going to get back the Serpent here, which is the right choice on their part. Unfortunately for them, we are going to then be able to go for a major Graceful play here. We could potentially Graceful discarding Serpent and Thunder Dragon, which I think probably is correct, but I mean, we drew another Graceful, so it really does not matter here. We're just going to go for another Graceful, draw 3, discard that Serpent, and then we got to think about the other card to discard here. We're actually going to discard the Cyber Jar. This could be good later to sort of get rid of, like, an established board state they might have, like Fire Princess and the like. But with this Mystical Space Typhoon in hand, I feel perfectly fine about just doing it this way. Mystical Space Typhoon can deal with whatever floodgates they may have. We're just going to bring out the Gemini Elf and attack into their set here. And it's actually a Cyber Jar, so we're going to get a lot more cards to hand here. Honestly, not the best, I guess. I mean, it's not terrible, but, like, we can't really do much more extending this turn. And also we'll have to discard for hand size at the end of the turn. So they reveal a Tribute to the Doom, Graceful Charity, Gravity Bind, UFO Turtle, and Pot of Greed, all of which are, like, pretty decent. They can Pot and Charity next turn, because we don't actually have an Imperial Order here. We reveal a Sangan, so Sangan's not really going to help against a UFO Turtle here, but that Mirror Force will disincentivize them from attacking in. So we're going to get out that Sangan, and we're actually just going to set it. No reason to put in attack. I mean, I guess if they've sided in Noblemen of Crossout against our deck, then that would be a reason. But I think ultimately this is fine. Maybe we should have actually just put in attack, because, like, we've got the Mirror Force anyways, so, like, they're not going to just, you know, attack into it. But I don't know. Yeah, maybe we should have done that, but it doesn't really matter that much in the long run, I think. Anyways, we're going to set 3. We're going to set Mystical Space Typhoon, and a Mirror Force here, because we're trying to lower our hand for the hand size. And we will, you know, we could have potentially set another spell, but our spells are so strong here, and we don't want to lose them to, like, a Harpy's Feather Duster, so we will just discard a Bazoo the Soul Eater here. We do have a lot of fodder in grave, but I do value the Kaiku more, because it can banish cards from their graveyard, things like Marie the Fallen One, etc. And also Cannon Soldier was very good last game, and Jinzo is very good at shutting down their things like Gravity Bind and the like, so I'd rather just have the Jinzo in hand to bring out next turn, potentially. They're going to go for a Pot of Greed here, draw 2. They're going to go for a Graceful Charity here, draw 3, and then discard 2. And they're going to discard a Dark Lord Marie, so they did get one. And they're also going to discard a UFO turtle, which makes sense. They're going to bring out a Fire Princess here, and they're just going to set a bunch, fire a Prohibition, calling MST. Prohibition's an interesting card that a lot of these stall decks can use. I honestly think they're pretty bad. Like, that's just my take on the card. There are other ways to get around them. For instance, we've got the Harpy's Feather Duster in hand to deal with the Prohibition if they call Mystical Space Typhoon. Also, if we were siding into things like Dust Tornado, that could have been dealt with that way as well. Also, something that will come up this game, cards that are already on field are not affected. And given you can just set the Mystical Space Typhoons beforehand, and most players often do, Prohibition becomes a lot worse in that case. So they're going to go for Prohibition calling MST, and I feel perfectly fine about this. We draw a Mystical Space Typhoon of our own, so I guess it will block that one. You know, quite unfortunate. But I feel like this is pretty fine. I just clarify in the chat on the side here whether I can actually, you know, use this set Mystical Space Typhoons, because I don't necessarily want to reveal that I have them in case, you know, I can't, but you can indeed do that at this time in the game's history. So what we're going to go for is we're just going to start by firing a Harpy's Feather Duster here. If they've got Imperial Order or something like that, then we can just chain a Mystical Space Typhoon, so I feel pretty fine about that. However, you know, they've got a Solemn Judgment, so maybe what I should have done here instead was summon the Jinzo, and, you know, that probably would have eaten the Solemn Judgment, but at least we would have been able to clear their entire back row, and we do have Reborn to bring back the Jinzo, so I think that would have been a much better play, but I did get a little bit greedy here. So that is quite unfortunate. Luckily, they will drop down to 4,000, and we've got this Dark Hole here to clear the field. We'll be able to get a Witch of the Black Forest off of that as well. And we could potentially go for the Jinzo play, reborning a monster, tributing out Jinzo, attacking in for 2,400. But I do think that that's a little bit fragile, especially since we do know about the Tribute to the Doom that they have in hand. So what we're actually going to do instead is we're just going to bring out this Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer and try attacking in, clearing their Marie from the graveyard, which I think is, you know, reasonable to do. They do have a Gravity Bind here, but we do have a Mystical Space Typhoon set, so we will be able to clear that. Deal 1,800, banish 2. And then I'm just going to pass back to them. I feel no real need to commit more to board. They reveal that their last two back row here are Solemn Wishes, which is perfectly fine. It means that they won't really have as many ways to stop our big aggressive pushes later here. They're going to go for a Tribute to the Doom, discarding Serpent, summon out a Witch of the Black Forest, and back it up with a Messenger of Peace here. This is perfectly fine. We're just actually going to Mirror Force this, and this may seem kind of crazy, but we just have game here next turn. We can bring out Cannon Soldier, Reborn out something like Sangan, and we don't even need to use the Mystical Space Typhoon on the Messenger of Peace, because we can just get in for 2,400, tribute off for 1,000. So the only real way this backfires is if they sided in Karibos, but I mean, if they sided into Karibos, I mean, I feel like we're still in a very good position. So we're just going to try and go for game next turn. They had a Fire Princess, not a Karibo, so I feel very good about this. They're going to pass back to us, and I mean, this is just the end of the game if they don't have a Karibo in hand. And that will indeed be the end of the game here. So this game felt really, really good on the part of the sort of meta Beast Spellcaster deck. And I think that just is how this deck can go against these sort of more rogue or trash tier level decks like Fire Princess. I think kind of is. The deck did see some improvements, but honestly, I don't think those improvements were enough to sort of carry it to playability. It may be rogue now, whereas last format it was trash tier, but I don't really think that distinction is really worth arguing about that much, as either way this deck I do not really think is viable in a competitive sense. However, since I did show it off here, and I think that these games did show off the major flaws with the deck, I don't really feel the need to cover it in its own video with me playing it. I hope that this game sort of showed off its major flaws, and I just don't really think that this deck is playable right now. It did get slightly better, I will admit that, but pretty much every deck in this format got better with the inclusion of things like Graceful Charity and Sinister Serpent. So that's not really that big of a thing. But I'm curious to know what you think of this game down in the comments below. Do you think I'm being a bit unfair on Fire Princess and that I should actually play it myself? Or do you think that I'm correct in my evaluation of it? Also, let me know what you thought of this build of the Good Stuff deck. I thought it performed like really well. I actually did like the Thunder Dragons in the deck, even though I did have some initial hesitations with them. But, you know, this very much was not a standard game that you'd see in this format. I am planning on showing off more of those in the future. But I'm curious to hear what your thoughts on the deck are. Also, if you're interested in this sort of content, content, please do subscribe to the channel. I'm planning on releasing a bunch more Joey-Pegasus videos in the future. And also we've got fun stuff coming up like a tournament on my Discord server in Critter format. And also I will hopefully be streaming a sort of, locals Critter tournament that's going to take place on my Discord this Friday. Time is still sort of undetermined. We're going to actually decide on that tomorrow once we see what works for the most people. But it will probably be in the evening EST. So definitely check that out if you're interested. Also, since I mentioned the Discord, it's a great place to find games in all these formats that I feature on the channel. So if any of these videos have piqued your interest in playing these old formats, then definitely check it out. It's an awesome place to be. And it's also where I've been holding the monthly tournaments that we've been having each month. So definitely check that out if you're interested. And I hope that you enjoyed the video as always. Until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.